December 15, 1944, Schmidtheim, Germany. As Obergruppenführer Hans Müller stood on the frozen ground, each step he took was marked by the rumbling of panzer tanks rolling westward through the night. He observed from inside a half-track as wave after wave of armored vehicles vanished into the Eifel woods. The following day would bring significant action and change the tide of war in Germany's favor, or so they hoped. Tomorrow, the Reich intended to demonstrate its continued military prowess to the world. His pen hovered over his diary, ready to record thoughts that could lead to execution if intercepted by superiors. He was told this offensive would divide Allied forces and compel them to negotiate peace terms. Despite wishing it were true with all his heart, he knew deep down that the reality painted a different picture. His cities had been reduced to ashes under enemy aerial bombardment, and now their troops were marching into Belgium with insufficient fuel reserves to even reach the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. Mathematically, the mission was unfeasible, a fact acknowledged by every soldier involved. Along a 75-mile stretch from Monchoss to Echternach, more than 200,000 German soldiers were preparing for Operation Wacht am Rhein, codenamed by Adolf Hitler as a defensive operation along Germany's western border, but actually masking the Wehrmacht's final desperate attempt to shift the war's outcome. This ambitious plan called for 3 German armies to break through thinly manned American positions in the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and advance 100 miles towards Antwerp, thereby splitting British and American forces and forcing a peace negotiation in the West. Success would enable Germany to redeploy its remaining resources against the advancing Soviet army in the East. In mid-November, when Hitler unveiled his plan to field commanders, they were left speechless. The Führer had devised the operation entirely on his own, disregarding objections from General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Field Marshal Walter Model as mere pessimism. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, who led the 5th Panzer Army, attended the planning sessions at Wolf's Lair with increasing apprehension. A seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front, where his tank divisions repeatedly thwarted Soviet offensives through superior tactics and mobility, Manteuffel was one of the few officers in the German military who truly understood armored warfare. He knew what resources were needed for this operation and realized that Germany no longer had them. On December 2, during a private meeting with Hitler, Manteuffel meticulously outlined his concerns. The offensive required surprise, favorable weather to ground Allied aircraft, rapid advancement to prevent American reinforcements, and above all, captured American fuel depots because German supplies could barely support the initial thrust. Without these factors aligning perfectly, the operation would fail. However, Hitler dismissed these objections with a flick of his hand, insisting that the superior will and fighting spirit of German soldiers would overcome material disadvantages. What Hitler overlooked was the fact that willpower alone could not propel tanks without fuel, produce ammunition for guns, or replace the 800 aircraft and 1,500 tanks Germany would commit to an operation with only a 10% chance of success. The forces assembled for Wacht am Rhein represented Germany's last strategic reserve. The 6th Panzer Army under SS Obergruppenführer Joseph Dietrich was tasked with delivering the main thrust in the north, driving past Liege to Antwerp. Despite commanding Germany's most powerful armored formation, Dietrich had never shown competence at the operational level. A loyal Nazi and personal favorite of Hitler since the early days of the party, Dietrich had risen through the ranks based on political reliability rather than military skill. General Field Marshal Walter Model privately referred to him as decent but lacking in intelligence, and his protests against Dietrich's appointment were ignored. The 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel would attack through the center toward Bastogne and Namur before turning north to meet Dietrich's forces. South of them, General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would defend the offensive's southern flank with infantry divisions that lacked both mobility and firepower, doing little more than slowing American counterattacks. On paper, the numbers looked impressive. Over 400,000 men would participate at various stages of the offensive. Approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 26 Zero artillery pieces, and 1,000 combat aircraft had been gathered from every corner of the dwindling Reich. However, these statistics masked severe vulnerabilities. Out of the 30 divisions assigned to the offensive, numerous were newly formed units comprising mostly teenagers and older men who had received little training. The panzer divisions, although armed with powerful Tiger and Panther tanks, suffered from a shortage of support vehicles, spare parts, and most importantly, fuel. Staff calculations revealed that the offensive could advance only 30 to 40 miles before running out of gasoline, while the Meuse River was located approximately 80 miles away, and Antwerp lay at a distance of 125 miles. The plan's success hinged on capturing intact American fuel depots early in the campaign. Otherwise, the German armored forces would be stranded deep within enemy territory if the Americans destroyed their supplies. Deception had been remarkably effective. Radio silence, nighttime movements, and a code name implying defensive operations kept Allied intelligence unaware of the substantial buildup. American commanders were convinced that Germany lacked the capability for such an offensive at this stage of the war. The Ardennes sector, which was to be the target, was held by 4 inexperienced or battle-fatigued divisions occupying what soldiers referred to as the Ghost Front. Yet deception could only go so far. Every German field commander understood that once the assault began, they would be racing against time as American reinforcements rushed into the Ardennes region. On December 16th, a cold and foggy dawn covered the Ardennes. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, over 16 Zero German artillery pieces unleashed a 90-minute barrage that shattered the winter silence. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, commanding a Panzer IV tank within the 2nd Panzer Division, had witnessed Soviet artillery barrages on the Eastern Front, which made this bombardment seem relatively mild by comparison. Nevertheless, he observed with grim satisfaction as American positions crumbled under the relentless shelling. Perhaps they were mistaken. Perhaps surprise and overwhelming firepower would prove sufficient after all. As his tank advanced, the infantry assault wave surged forward. Behind him, a multitude of panzers rolled toward Belgium, their engines rumbling through the morning fog. Inside the turret, Zimmermann checked his fuel level, which was 3/4 full, enough to reach the Meuse if they moved swiftly and encountered no issues. Each tanker in the column knew that this "if" carried significant weight. The 6th Panzer Army's northern attack faced immediate challenges. At Lanzerath, a lone American reconnaissance platoon supported by artillery observers halted an entire German parachute battalion for 10 hours. That evening, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, who led Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most formidable armored battle group of the 6th Army, arrived at Lanzerath to find the paratroopers still under fire. At 29 years old and a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, Peiper had established a reputation for aggressive tactics on the Eastern Front. Standing tall with blonde hair and fanatically devoted to the SS, he commanded around 48 Zero men, equipped with 117 tanks and numerous support vehicles. His mission was straightforward: break through American defenses and push toward the Meuse without stopping or considering his flanks, seizing bridges before they could be demolished. As the spearhead of the spearhead, Peiper's success would determine the fate of the entire offensive. Frustrated by the delay, he ordered his tanks to advance at midnight, leading the column himself through dark and narrow forest roads where engine noise echoed through valleys. The original plan had called for Peiper to reach the Meuse in 12 hours. However, He was already 6 hours behind schedule and still hadn't broken free from American defensive positions. At Hansfeld, his tanks overran American forces, capturing vehicles, supplies, and hundreds of prisoners. The Americans were caught completely off guard, with some soldiers still asleep when German tanks rolled into their encampments. Piper continued westward without delay, stopping only to refuel from captured American fuel depots along the way. His armored columns stretched for miles through the dense forest, resembling a river of steel advancing towards their objectives. However, narrow roads designed for agricultural use rather than heavy vehicles led to severe traffic congestion. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and self-propelled artillery units were stuck in long queues, wasting fuel as they idled in the cold. On December 17th, near a crossroads outside Malmedy at Borne, Kampfgruppe Piper encountered an American convoy from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a brief exchange of fire, the Americans surrendered. The events that followed would cast a dark shadow over the offensive and establish a brutal precedent. No quarter would be given. German SS troops forced about 120 captured Americans into an open field and opened fire with machine guns. Those who survived the initial barrage were hunted down and shot. Wounded soldiers received finishing shots to their heads. When it was done, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the snow. News of this massacre rapidly spread through American units, fueling shock and confusion with cold fury. Soldiers who had previously been inclined to surrender under overwhelming German pressure now fought with fierce determination. The incident at Malmedy drastically altered the nature of the battle, ensuring that no American territory would be relinquished easily. In the sector controlled by Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, the offensive initially achieved greater success. Manteuffel had successfully advocated for an attack without preliminary artillery bombardment, leading to even more surprise. His forces overwhelmed positions held by the 106th Infantry Division, encircling 2 entire regiments. Over subsequent days, nearly 9,000 American soldiers surrendered, marking the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe during World War II. Manteuffel's tanks pressed forward towards critical road junctions at Sandvith and Bastonia, which were vital to control over the Ardennes road network. If these towns fell quickly, nothing could halt the German advance to their objectives. Oberstleutnant Meinrad von Lockert, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, drove his tanks ahead with reckless speed. His leading units skirted past key American strongholds, leaving them for subsequent infantry to deal with as his panzers advanced further into Belgium. From the 5th Army headquarters maps, it was evident that German forces had made significant progress, advancing up to 20 miles in certain sectors and seemingly overwhelming American defenses. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that Hitler's risky strategy might pay off. However, Lieutenant Friedrich Rack, an experienced panzer officer, anxiously monitored the fuel gauge on his Panther tank. They had pushed forward 15 miles, but had already consumed half of their fuel supply. The narrow roads snaked through dense forests, hindering cross-country travel. Each diversion and detour to circumvent damaged bridges further depleted their gasoline reserves. His company had initiated the offensive with 22 tanks. However, 3 had broken down due to mechanical issues, a result of inadequate maintenance and worn-out engines. While German industry was producing high-quality tanks, it struggled to manufacture sufficient spare parts for upkeep. Rack's crew had been assured that they would find captured American fuel depots along their route, but instead encountered only burnt-out supply points where retreating Americans had destroyed everything before withdrawing. The arithmetic of fuel consumption became increasingly evident. At this rate, they would exhaust their fuel supplies somewhere between Saint-Vith and the Meuse River, leaving their tanks vulnerable as immobile targets for American aircraft. On December 18th, the weather began to change in favor of the Allies. As fog and clouds had previously grounded Allied air forces, these conditions started to dissipate. American fighter-bombers now appeared over the battlefield, wreaking havoc on German columns with devastating precision. Hauptmann Hans Schmidt, who commanded a company of Panzer Grenadiers, witnessed P-47 Thunderbolts strafing his unit, reducing 3 trucks and a half-track to rubble in mere seconds. Without prior notice, fighter planes swooped down through openings in the cloud cover, deploying rockets and gunfire before ascending back into the overcast skies. German forces found themselves almost completely unprotected against air attacks. Despite assurances from the Luftwaffe of providing aerial support, very few German aircraft materialized to provide cover. Most of Germany's remaining aircraft had been reserved for another operation, and fuel shortages further constrained the number of combat missions that could be flown. American planes became more frequent in their appearances, leaving behind a trail of smoldering vehicles along the roads. The progress of the advance was repeatedly hindered as units sought shelter from incoming aerial assaults. At La Glaise, Piper's Kampfgruppe had come to a standstill, encircled by American forces and devoid of fuel supplies. Out of the original 48 men and 117 tanks, Piper now commanded fewer than 800 soldiers and just 25 immobilized armored vehicles with empty fuel reserves. The village was under constant bombardment from American artillery, while infantry and tanks continued to tighten their grip around the German forces. On December 22nd, a resupply mission by the Luftwaffe intended to deliver essential supplies like fuel and ammunition to Piper's encircled troops failed, as over 90% of the dropped supplies landed outside German-controlled territory. Piper radioed for permission to lead an unauthorized retreat on foot, leaving behind all vehicles. This request was escalated through multiple levels of command until it reached Dietrich, who in turn forwarded it to Hitler. The next day a response came back: "Hold your ground and reinforcements are en route." Yet Piper was certain no additional help would arrive, as American forces had control over every access point. His men were down to their last rations, and wounded soldiers were receiving minimal medical care while hiding in cellars. On December 23rd, faced with dwindling resources and worsening conditions, Piper decided to withdraw without waiting for official approval. That evening, 800 surviving soldiers left their tanks and vehicles behind, sneaking past American defensive lines on foot to eventually reach German positions several days later. Kampfgruppe Piper, the most formidable armored unit in the offensive operation, was annihilated without accomplishing any significant strategic goals. Similar scenarios unfolded across the entire front. In St. Vith, American defenders held out far longer than expected by German planners, effectively tying up crucial road junctions until December 21st. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions formed an unbreakable northern bulwark that channeled the 6th Panzer Army into narrow valleys, where it faced relentless artillery fire from American forces. In Bastogne, the timely arrival of the 101st Airborne Division thwarted German attempts to seize the town. The division established a formidable fortress that withstood repeated attacks. On December 22nd, General Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, sent a surrender ultimatum to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe's one-word response, "Nuts," became legendary in military history. When German officers sought clarification, they were informed that it meant go to hell. The 101st Airborne Division managed to hold Bastogne until Christmas, while the Panzer forces under Manteuffel tried to bypass the town and continue their advance westward. However, control of Bastogne was essential for maintaining supply lines and reinforcing German troops. Without controlling the town, German forces could not sustain a western push. On December 24th, Clear skies appeared in the Ardennes for the first time in a week, marking a turning point that German planners had feared. Within hours, Allied aircraft filled the sky. Over 5,000 sorties were flown that day, targeting German supply columns and stalled tank formations while dropping supplies to isolated American units. Feldwebel Karl Mayr, commanding a Tiger tank battalion, watched in frustration as P-47 fighter bombers systematically destroyed his supply convoy. With no ammunition or fuel, his tanks became ineffective and immobile. American fighter pilots had prioritized attacking fuel trucks, understanding that immobilizing German tanks would make them easier targets later on. Mayr's battalion began the offensive with 45 Tiger tanks, but now only 19 were operational. The rest were abandoned due to lack of fuel, destroyed by aerial strikes, or damaged in close combat. With armor so thick it could withstand most American tank fire and an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied vehicle from a distance, the Tiger was Germany's most formidable tank. However, this strength was irrelevant when their tanks were stationary, empty fuel tanks exposed to circling American fighter bombers. By December 25th, the offensive had reached its peak. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had advanced as far as 4 miles from the Meuse River near Dinant, marking the deepest German penetration. Yet this spearhead was isolated, encircled, and without fuel. To the north, British tanks from XXX Corps held strong positions at the Meuse crossings. Meanwhile, to the south, Patton's Third Army disengaged from Lorraine, pivoted 90 degrees northward, and struck the German salient's southern flank with force. The weather had turned against Germany, providing American artillery observers with clear visibility for precise targeting. Allied logistics operated like a well-oiled machine, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily, while German supply convoys were decimated by air attacks. By this point, the bulge that gave the battle its name had reached its maximum extension. The Allies now planned to compress it shut. Hauptmann Otto Krebs, who had led a Panzer Grenadier company during the initial stages of the offensive, sat in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne on Christmas Day, struggling to grasp why they had failed despite achieving complete surprise, breaking through American lines, and advancing up to 30 miles in some sectors. The Americans remained resilient. Each small town transformed into a fortified stronghold, and every intersection became critical on the battlefield. Initially, his company comprised 160 men, but only 48 were still combat-ready. The rest had fallen in battle or gone missing. They lacked ammunition for their mortars, and had barely enough rifle rounds left for one more skirmish, with no hope of resupply due to American air superiority controlling all road access. Their Christmas dinner consisted merely of frozen bread and weak coffee. Meanwhile, Krebs could hear continuous American artillery fire, powered by an endless supply chain that seemed limitless. He had fought in the Eastern Front, where massive Soviet offensives overwhelmed German positions with sheer numerical and material force. This situation was different. The Americans fought with precision and coordination across infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, all while maintaining their soldiers' well-being and logistical capabilities beyond belief. At German headquarters, the harsh reality of defeat gradually pierced through layers of denial. Model repeatedly requested permission to withdraw, fearing that American counterattacks could encircle and destroy the entire force if they stayed. However, Hitler refused, insisting on renewed attacks towards the Meuse River and demanding commanders show unwavering determination for victory. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, establishing a lifeline into the besieged town. The Americans swiftly reinforced and supplied Bastogne, turning it from a defensive outpost into a hub for counterattacks. Manteuffel's troops, who had bypassed the city under the assumption it held only a minor garrison, encountered an unexpectedly fortified American stronghold behind them. This posed a significant threat to their supply lines and obstructed key retreat routes. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its final major operation of the war, known as Operation Bodenplatte. Over 900 German aircraft carried out surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, resulting in the destruction of roughly 200 Allied planes on the ground. For a short period, it appeared Germany could still deliver devastating blows. However, this operation turned out to be a strategic blunder. The Luftwaffe suffered approximately 280 aircraft destroyed, and over 230 pilots killed, missing, captured, or wounded, including wing commanders, squadron leaders, and highly experienced aviators who were irreplaceable. The Allies managed to replace their lost planes within days, while Germany could not recover the pilots and aircraft it had lost, marking a critical blow to its air force. Oberst Johann Steinhoff, one of Germany's top-scoring fighter pilots, witnessed with mounting alarm as returning aircraft landed, revealing the extent of the losses. The Luftwaffe had wagered everything on this single operation and lost. From that moment onward, German forces would face battles without substantial air support, while Allied fighter bombers relentlessly hunted them. The offensive created a bulge 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide at its base, but failed to achieve any strategic objectives. The news remained favorable for the Allies as Antwerp was left unthreatened. No split or encirclement of Allied armies occurred. Most importantly, the operation had depleted Germany's last strategic reserves of manpower, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. Each panzer division committed to the Ardennes offensive was essentially destroyed as a fighting unit, with no replacements available. New tank production could not meet the demand, and fuel supplies were exhausted. The offensive had consumed months' worth of accumulated resources that Germany would never be able to replenish. On January 3rd, American forces initiated significant counteroffensives from both north and south, with the objective of closing in on the Bulge and encircling the German troops within it. By January 8th, under intense pressure, Hitler reluctantly permitted a restricted withdrawal, although by then an organized retreat was no longer feasible. The Germans retreated while continuously engaging in fierce rearguard battles as American forces relentlessly attacked them from land and air. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a tank commander with the 9th Panzer Division, documented these harrowing days through letters that remained unsent until his death in February 1945. Our vehicles are being destroyed for lack of fuel to move them. Every roadway is jammed with abandoned equipment. The Americans relentlessly pursue us day and night. Their aircraft appear as soon as the skies clear, while their artillery tracks our movements with astonishing precision. We embarked on this offensive convinced we could alter the course of the war. Now all we strive for is survival, escaping the trap we ourselves created. Soldiers no longer talk about victory. Instead, they focus on reaching the Siegfried Line alive and finding shelter from the relentless American bombardment. We wagered everything on the Ardennes offensive, but it has failed. Germany now lacks any reserves, fuel, or illusions of success. The Russians advance from the east, while Allied forces press forward from the west, leaving us exhausted after one last desperate offensive that yielded nothing except hastened destruction. By January 25, 1945, German troops had been forced back to their initial positions. Thus, the Battle of the Bulge concluded. The casualty figures underscored a devastating defeat. Approximately 400,000 men were committed to the offensive, with between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties, including roughly 12,000 fatalities. The Wehrmacht suffered significant losses of 600 tanks and assault guns, which could not be replenished. The Luftwaffe also experienced hundreds of aircraft losses, along with irreplaceable pilots. Months of effort in amassing German fuel reserves were rendered futile as they were entirely depleted. Artillery ammunition meticulously stockpiled for the offensive was also completely used up. These setbacks left Germany without the capacity to undertake major military operations on a large scale once again. The Americans incurred around 81,000 casualties, including approximately 19,000 fatalities. But unlike Germany, America possessed the capability to replace these losses rapidly. Daily shipments from American shores supplied fresh divisions, new equipment, and endless provisions, ensuring that their military operations could continue despite the human cost. While the American dead would be mourned, their absence would not paralyze military activities. In contrast, Germany's casualties, both in terms of fatalities, wounded, and prisoners, were irrecoverable losses. Beyond the immediate toll of lives lost, there was a substantial strategic disadvantage. The offensive delayed Allied plans to cross the Rhine by about 6 weeks. However, it also impeded Soviet operations in Eastern Europe, as Stalin initiated a major winter offensive on January 12th, compelling Germany to redeploy reinforcements eastward at a time when they were most needed for defense in the Ardennes. Hitler had anticipated that securing a decisive victory in the West would allow Germany to focus its efforts against the Soviets. In reality, the Ardennes offensive consumed valuable forces desperately required in the East without achieving any significant gains in the West. When the Soviet Vistula offensive commenced, weakened German defenses were encountered, allowing the Red Army to advance nearly 300 miles within 3 weeks and reach the Oder River less than 50 miles from Berlin. The panzer divisions obliterated during the Ardennes offensive could have potentially slowed this advance, but instead lay in ruins in Belgian forests, symbolizing strategic miscalculation. Oberst Hermann Gessler, who had commanded a Volksgrenadier division during the offensive, compiled an extensive after-action report that was never submitted because by the time he completed it, there was no longer a functioning command structure to receive such documentation. His critique was exceedingly candid. The Ardennes offensive faltered due to flawed assumptions that lacked grounding in reality. We presumed complete surprise, which we indeed achieved. We expected bad weather to immobilize Allied aircraft for a week. However, the terrain's poor design for armored vehicles rendered rapid advances unfeasible despite our success on the roads. Furthermore, we anticipated capturing enough American fuel to sustain our progress, only to find that the Americans had sabotaged their own supplies or blocked our access to them. We also assumed that newly arrived American divisions would quickly disintegrate under pressure from our initial attack. Instead, these units demonstrated remarkable resilience and tenacity at every critical junction. Our strategy hinged on a belief that sheer determination could compensate for material deficiencies, such as fuel shortages and ammunition scarcity. Moreover, we imagined that courage alone could prevail against overwhelming Allied air superiority. At its core, the offensive rested on an unrealistic faith in Hitler's directive, assuming that any operation he ordered must succeed by default. This was not sound military planning. It amounted to wishful thinking that ultimately decimated Germany's last viable defensive forces. The repercussions of this campaign extended far beyond a mere military setback. The 6th Panzer Army, which had made little progress during the Ardennes offensive, was redeployed to Hungary for a final assault near Lake Balaton in March 1945. This effort failed disastrously against Soviet defenses and resulted in the effective destruction of the 6th Panzer Army. Dietrich survived the war but faced prosecution at the Malmedy trials for his role in war crimes, receiving a life sentence that was eventually commuted to a reduced term. He was released from prison in 1955 and passed away in 1966 without ever admitting to the massacre committed by his troops. Similarly, Piper stood trial alongside Detrick at Malmedy for war crimes. Initially sentenced to death, his sentence was later revised to life imprisonment. He too was paroled in 1956. Afterward, he relocated to France where he lived under an assumed identity until his true identity was revealed in 1976. His home was destroyed by firebombing, resulting in Piper's death, as the past massacre caught up with him 31 years after the events at Bonnier Crossroads. Manteuffel survived the war, surrendered to British forces, and served a short prison sentence. He later entered German politics, serving in the Bundestag, and introduced the term Bundeswehr for West Germany's military. He lectured at West Point on the Ardennes campaign, examining how American adaptability and logistics overpowered German armored tactics. During interviews in the 1970s, Manteuffel openly discussed the offensive's futility from a purely military perspective. From an operational standpoint, the Ardennes attack made no sense. Germany lacked the resources to reach Antwerp. We did not have enough fuel to advance beyond the Meuse River. Our Air Force could not protect ground columns from Allied fighter bombers. Furthermore, we lacked reserves to capitalize on any breakthroughs achieved. The offensive succeeded tactically by surprising and breaking through American lines, but failed operationally because we couldn't sustain the advance. Strategically, even if we had reached Antwerp, which was impossible, it would have had no impact on forcing a negotiation or altering the war's outcome. Germany was already defeated. The Battle of the Bulge highlighted the distinction between tactical prowess and strategic reality. German soldiers fought with skill and determination throughout the offensive. Commanders executed complex operations under challenging conditions. Tank crews demonstrated tactical superiority in individual battles. Yet, it all amounted to nothing because Germany lacked the industrial capacity, logistical support, and resources necessary for sustained offensive operations. The Americans were caught off guard and suffered significant losses initially, but their subsequent actions showcased the profound impact of material advantages and organizational resilience. Within a short period, Eisenhower managed to move divisions across vast distances, reconfigure command hierarchies, and assemble an overwhelming force in response to the German advance. American logistical support continued to deliver thousands of tons of supplies daily despite harsh winter conditions and damaged infrastructure. American manufacturing swiftly replaced each lost tank, destroyed truck, and expended artillery shell. The outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was not due to superior tactical maneuvers or battlefield performance on the part of the Americans. In several engagements, German forces demonstrated higher tactical proficiency. Instead, the battle was won by the robustness of American logistics, the rapid replacement capabilities of its industrial base, and an army capable of rapidly redeploying large units over great distances during a crisis. Additionally, complete air superiority allowed American fighters to engage German ground columns with impunity. For Germany, the Ardennes offensive marked the end of strategic adaptability. After the offensive's failure, the Wehrmacht was relegated to purely defensive operations. The initiative now fully belonged to the Allies. In the east, Soviet forces steadily advanced toward Berlin. Meanwhile, in the west, American and British troops prepared for the crossing of the Rhine. Germany's cities were systematically devastated by strategic bombing, and oil production dwindled under relentless air attacks. Transportation systems began to collapse, and food supplies became scarce. The industrial capacity that had sustained 4 years of war was deteriorating rapidly. German soldiers no longer fought with the aim of securing victory. Instead, they engaged in combat primarily to prevent defeat, to keep Allied armies at bay for an additional day, week, or month. They continued to fight because surrendering meant betrayal according to their indoctrination. Despite the ruins of cities, the millions who had perished, and the utter hopelessness of their situation, soldiers persisted in battle. The Nazi regime continued to dominate Germany, with desertion carrying severe penalties for soldiers and their families alike. The Battle of the Bulge resulted in roughly 100,000 German casualties and depleted critical resources such as fuel, ammunition, and equipment that could not be easily replaced. Despite these losses, Germany failed to achieve any significant strategic objectives. The offensive merely delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks, pushing back the planned crossing of the Rhine from February until March 1945. This was all that came from the immense sacrifices made. To secure this brief delay, Germany exhausted its remaining mobile forces, ensuring weakened defenses when the Allies eventually crossed the Rhine, leading to rapid collapse. Additionally, vital panzer divisions intended for Eastern Front defense were squandered, and precious fuel reserves were expended, potentially hindering any last-ditch fighting withdrawal that might have prolonged resistance. The Ardennes offensive represented Hitler's final attempt at a military victory. However, it turned out to be an extremely costly blunder, perhaps the most expensive failure of World War II, as it squandered resources Germany desperately needed, but could not afford to lose in pursuit of unattainable goals. Paul Schmidt, who served as an infantryman with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division during the initial assault and survived the war, documented his experiences in the 1960s. His narrative vividly illustrated how German soldiers' optimism gradually gave way to harsh realities. Initial euphoria over the offensive soon faded after a few days of apparent success, as American units began retreating only to be followed by the sobering realization of mounting losses and diminishing prospects for victory. American resistance intensified. Their artillery barrages grew more frequent, and counterattacks forced us to abandon the positions we had seized. Every clear day saw Allied aircraft descending upon our forces, raining destruction on our supply lines and transport vehicles. Fighter planes continuously harassed our columns, targeting trucks carrying supplies, fuel tankers, and ammunition carriers. Without these essentials, our advance ground to a halt. Without fuel, our tanks became stationary targets. Without supplies, we could not sustain our momentum. By Christmas, it was evident that the offensive had faltered. By New Year's Day, pessimism set in as we realized an orderly retreat back to Germany would be fortunate under the circumstances. Our withdrawal began late in January, signaling the collapse of a division. Of those who launched the assault on December 16th, less than one-third managed to return across enemy lines. Many were casualties or captives. In the Ardennes, the Germans lost the war not due to American military superiority, but because our own flawed strategy and inadequate resources doomed us from the start. We had embarked on an operation with insufficient materials, unrealistic goals, and misguided planning, resulting in a staggering loss of 50,000 lives. The soldiers who fought in this campaign were far removed from those who conquered France or advanced into Russia just a few years prior. Many were inexperienced teenagers trained for only weeks, armed with outdated weaponry, while others were middle-aged men drafted from civilian roles to replace battle losses. The SS divisions, traditionally elite units, had become diluted by unseasoned recruits. Our equipment was a hodgepodge of obsolete weapons, captured material from various nations, and German vehicles that functioned poorly due to mechanical issues. Additionally, logistical efforts suffered as Germany's transportation infrastructure crumbled under relentless air raids. The Wehrmacht that launched its assault on the Ardennes bore little resemblance to the formidable force that had once dominated Europe just 4 years prior. This was an army of weary soldiers fighting with outdated equipment, motivated by increasingly unrealistic beliefs, and clinging desperately to the hope that Germany might somehow avoid total defeat despite mounting evidence to the contrary. However, remnants of Germany's earlier successes remained evident. German tactical doctrine continued to emphasize initiative at lower levels, where company and battalion commanders were expected to make decisions and seize opportunities independently without waiting for orders from higher echelons. This flexibility had served Germany well in previous campaigns. In the Ardennes, it enabled isolated units to continue their offensive even when communication lines broke down and the overall attack clearly stalled. German tank crews still demonstrated exceptional skill. Tiger and Panther tanks, when adequately supplied with fuel and ammunition, outmatched most Allied armor. When properly led and sufficiently resupplied, German infantry fought tenaciously. Yet none of these tactical advantages could alter the strategic reality that Germany was fighting a war it no longer had any chance of winning against adversaries who possessed overwhelming material superiority. Tactical prowess and combat determination were insufficient when the enemy could sustain losses and replenish its forces while Germany struggled to do so. The Battle of the Bulge exposed the fundamental failure of Nazi Germany's strategic position. Since 1943, Hitler's strategy had been to inflict heavy casualties on Germany's enemies in hopes that they would negotiate rather than continue fighting. This approach rested on flawed assumptions. Democracies were weak, the Allies would collapse under mounting losses, and British and American populations would demand peace as casualties mounted. Every aspect of this thinking proved erroneous. The Allies were prepared to endure significant casualties to secure German defeat. When American units faced initial setbacks in the early days of the Ardennes offensive, U.S. commanders responded by swiftly deploying reinforcements to contain the breakthrough rather than contemplating negotiations. Similarly, when British tanks secured the Meuse crossings, denying Germans their primary objective, the British government remained unwavering in its commitment to Germany's unconditional surrender. The Allies comprehended what Hitler refused to acknowledge. Germany had lost its ability to influence the war's essential course. Instead of questioning if Germany would be defeated, the debate centered on when it would happen and at what cost. The Ardennes offensive merely increased German casualties by about 100,000 without altering these outcomes. This operation effectively removed any chance for a conditional surrender, as evidenced by atrocities like the Malmedy massacre and other war crimes committed by SS units during the offensive. When American prisoners were executed at Malmedy and Belgian civilians were murdered elsewhere, Allied leaders lost whatever sympathy they might have harbored towards Germany. These actions guaranteed that demands for unconditional surrender and full occupation would be non-negotiable. The Ardennes offensive ensured there would be no room for a negotiated peace or escape from justice for Nazi leadership. By February 1945, as the last German forces withdrew to the Siegfried Line, the military situation was dire. Soviet troops were within 60 miles of Berlin in the east, while Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine with overwhelming force in the west. Air attacks on synthetic fuel plants had nearly halted Germany's oil production, leaving aircraft grounded for lack of aviation fuel and tanks immobilized due to a lack of gasoline. German cities faced relentless round-the-clock bombing, transportation networks were severely disrupted, and the economy was crumbling. Food supplies were inadequate, and the Nazi regime maintained control through terror, executing soldiers accused of defeatism and hanging civilians suspected of doubt about victory. Germany had become a nightmare state fighting for its own demise. The regime's preference to destroy Germany rather than admit defeat rendered surrender impossible, while victory became unattainable due to sheer material superiority. Soldiers returning from the Ardennes offensive carried with them the realization that their country was doomed. They had witnessed firsthand the overwhelming material power of the Allies. They had felt the crushing force of Allied air superiority. They recognized the futility of combating adversaries who could replenish their losses more swiftly than Germany could inflict them. Some continued to fight out of loyalty to their units and comrades, while others fought due to the severe consequences of desertion. There were also those whose critical thinking abilities had been eroded by the Nazi regime, compelling them to obey orders without considering the outcomes. Few harbored any illusions about winning. The Ardennes offensive marked Germany's last major offensive effort. Following February, German forces engaged in purely defensive battles, conducting delaying actions and futile last stands in cities destined for destruction during their defense. Although the war persisted for 3 additional months, its outcome had already been sealed. Defeat, occupation, and division awaited Germany. The Nazi regime would be dismantled, and millions more lives would be lost in the final battles, deaths that bought only a brief delay of an inevitable conclusion. From the German viewpoint, the Battle of the Bulge was characterized by delusion, denial, and defeat. It was a tale of soldiers dispatched to undertake the impossible with insufficient resources by leaders who refused to acknowledge reality. It exemplified tactical prowess squandered in pursuit of strategic impossibility. Despite courage and determination exhibited by German troops, their efforts yielded no meaningful results other than hastening the destruction they aimed to prevent. Soldiers in the Ardennes fought valiantly under challenging conditions, achieving surprise, breaking through enemy lines, advancing deep into Belgium, and inflicting significant casualties on American forces. Ultimately, these achievements were rendered meaningless due to a flawed strategic premise. Germany lacked both the capability and resources to defeat the Allied coalition militarily. As Germany extended its involvement in the conflict, it moved closer to total annihilation. Each soldier who perished in the Ardennes did so in vain because the offensive had no chance of success and merely ensured a comprehensive German loss. The outcome was grim. Germany suffered 100,000 casualties, lost 600 tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and vast amounts of fuel and ammunition that could not be replenished. In exchange for this devastating toll, they only managed to delay Allied operations by 6 weeks without securing any strategic advantages whatsoever. The Ardennes offensive was a disastrous failure, representing more than just a military defeat. It extinguished the last vestige of hope that Germany might still triumph in the war. Following this campaign, even the most fervent Nazis acknowledged that their nation faced not merely defeat but utter devastation. This operation drained away the final reserves capable of delaying ultimate destruction, ensuring that when collapse came, it would be swift and total. From a German viewpoint, the Battle of the Bulge marked the moment when Germany's destiny was sealed, when any lingering optimism about victory evaporated in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority in terms of resources and air power. Despite their belief that they were defending their homeland, soldiers fighting in the Ardennes unwittingly participated in an endeavor destined to hasten Germany's downfall, ordered by a regime bent on catastrophic failure rather than acknowledging mistakes. The offensive was launched against adversaries whose material advantages rendered courage and tactical skill irrelevant. The Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's last attempt at an offensive strike and its ultimate failure. It began with artillery fire on December 16, 1944, and concluded when German forces withdrew on January 25, 1945. During this period, Germany engaged in a futile battle, sacrificing time it could ill afford and depleting resources that were irreplaceable. The inevitable outcome was hastened defeat, brought about by an offensive designed to prevent just such a result.